stormy weather since my...
Hello and welcome to our next podcast in our Archetype series. In this one, we wanted to look at the patterns of weather and seasons and how these seem to be relatively universal in their application in literature from around the world. So let's go ahead and start looking at weather. And so this would be the kind of detail we would need to pay attention to when we were perhaps looking at the establishment of setting at the beginning of novels, short stories, etc., but also throughout that text. How does the weather change? How does it go from something that is a relatively sunny day and everything seems to be going great, but then all of a sudden the weather changes and goes to some sort of raging tempest? And so what's cool about the weather archetype is that, again, since it is so universal, since it crosses genres and time periods and cultures, you're going to see this in literature from around the world. What's so cool about the weather archetype is that it often predicts and reflects the mood of a text. So sometimes, if everything is going well and characters are having a happy conversation, you will see that narration sets the stage to be relatively happy, positive, sunny, no wind, calm. The weather surrounding a happy event is happy weather. But then you may see, when characters begin to fight, that the narration changes and describes the weather in very negative terms. Horrendous storm, tornadoes, tempests, gusts, dark, cloudy, gloomy, etc. And so oftentimes the story will just continue on and have characters doing whatever they're doing, and then the weather reflects that mood. But the cool thing about the weather archetype is that sometimes it can predict what is going to happen in terms of the plot. So instead of having everything's happy and then we see narration about the weather, we might have those two structures reversed. We might see the classic, "It was a dark and stormy night," meaning narration comes first. We can then latch onto that and we can know that this is going to be a dark, sad story because the weather has come first, and that's going to predict that this is not going to go well. So as we are reading, we should be paying attention to that narration. How is weather described? Does it seem to reinforce what we're seeing? Or do we have some sort of a clash? Do we have two characters that seem to be getting along, but then the narration shifts to dark and gloomy weather? If so, that could be hinting that that relationship is going to change or go south and not be so great. And so we want to pay attention to that. It's not just the author setting up the weather saying it was a hot and stormy day. We have to be aware of it because that does have powerful connections archetypally to emotions and characters throughout texts. For example, oftentimes authors will set their pieces in very hot, steamy, summery months. And as a result, those texts tend to be very heightened in terms of their passion, in terms of the clashes, in terms of the conflict. For example, in the classic text of To Kill a Mockingbird, the horrible trial of Tom Robinson takes place in the height of the summer. There is so much narration describing the weather around that time period, about how the courthouse was sweltering, how people were melting, people were excessively sweating and trying to fan themselves. And that seems to reflect the feeling of the town, that people were very much passionate about this trial, and how dare a black man talk to, let alone have a relationship with a white woman. And so the weather in Harper Lee's narration is setting up the emotions of the trial. And so it really, in this case, archetypally reinforces the passion of the trial through the weather. So in a more modern version, you may have the text of In the Heights, the Broadway musical. And so the setting of this piece is Washington Heights, the Upper West Side of Manhattan. This story is set in the height of summer, July 3rd and 4th, on a very tiny street corner where all of these different people are trying to figure out who they are, where are they going, what's their future like. We have romances budding, romances failing, confusion happening, but again, the weather reinforces those passions.
Ay, mama, the summer's hottest day. Paciencia y fe, paciencia y fe. Ay, carajo, it's hot!
Because it is so hot, it drives characters to do certain things and helps propel the plot forward and that the idea of passion is there, and that is reflected with the continual references to the height of summer, the season of passion. And again, that idea of weather change also reflects and sometimes predicts the mood of the text and kind of tells us where we're going. In the upper right, we see a still from Megamind. When Megamind is dating Miss Ritchie, everything's fine. The weather's completely normal. But as soon as they have a fight and she steps out of the restaurant one night, magically a rainstorm moves in. She's exceptionally sad, depressed. Her weather has changed. A very similar scene from Crazy Stupid Love. Steve Carell and his ex-wife have kind of gotten back together at their students' parent-teacher conference. Things were going okay for about 10 seconds, and then everything went horribly wrong. Some secrets were revealed at this parent-teacher conference. As he is leaving, he has another fight with his ex-wife. She drives off in a huff. And then magically the weather rolls in, rain starts, and he is left alone, despondent, sad, in the rain. And the character even says, as the rain is coming down on him, as he realizes his own sadness, he says, how cliche. Because every time in a text where something is going wrong, if we pay attention to the weather, we will see that sad weather means sad emotions. So not only should we be looking at weather, so individual kind of moments in time, but we should also be looking at the 4 seasons and where that fits into the general life stage of our universal world. And again, what's cool about Archetypes is that this is not just true for Western literature. This is true for Hispanic literature, for African literature, Asian, across the world, across times. Whenever stories are set in certain seasons, those stories have different feels to them. And what's cool is that different genres of literature are associated with different seasons. For example, we have the season of spring, which often symbolizes rebirth and perhaps the mating season in the animal kingdom. So as green buds are coming out, trees are growing, flowers are blooming, we also have this rebirth of human emotion. And so we tend to see a lot of comedies set in the spring. Many of Shakespeare's plays that are classified as comedies take place in the season of spring. Everybody's waking up from the slumber of winter, and all of a sudden they're noticing the opposite gender. They want to meet them, they want to hang out, but we have this rebirth of interest, rebirth of emotion, and that parallels the natural world. And so again, across time and culture, you're going to see that when an author wants something to be very positive or emotionally growing, they're probably going to set their text in spring. Following spring, of course, comes summer with great increases in heat temperature-wise, but that's also going to bring the fullness of life when people can be outside experiencing the world and experiencing all the full range of emotions. Oftentimes, summer is synonymous or the same with the idea of passion and romance. The idea of the summer love, as in the example from Greece in the middle. They get together in the summer when there are no rules, school is out, there's no structure, passion and heat are there, emotions can run high, complete unadulterated romance can happen. And so because of that, we often see the genre of summer being romantic or romance. Of course, after every summer, we have to have fall. And this is where the leaves start to change colors, start to fall off. And so as the natural world is dying or falling apart or decaying, so does literature. We see thematic issues like death, decay, dying coming out. And we tend to see stories that are more tragic in nature. For example, Hamlet is set kind of in the fall, transitioning into winter. That is not a summer story. That's a horrible story of brothers killing brothers and ghosts and all kinds of sad things. It feels heavy. It feels like there's chaos going on. Therefore, it should probably be set in a very sad season. And while football fans love the fall because of all the great games that are on, in general, fall is a very darkening, the days are getting shorter, things are falling off the trees, the colors are darkening to reds and oranges from the normal green, and so it reflects in the genre of tragedy that things are becoming more sad, and so that is reflected through that season. Then needless to say, our last season that we would look at, depending on how we start your calendar year, is the idea of winter. Winter itself in places where we get snow is full of death and desolation. Outside nature has basically hibernated, it has basically died. And so that is reflected in the literature. Stories that are set in the winter tend to be very sad. They just feel cold and heavy, and it's very dangerous because at any moment a character could die of all kinds of things. So for example, we have the story of Fargo in the upper right, a Coen Brothers movie, set in the dead of winter in Minnesota near North Dakota. What could be more desolate than that? It just feels cold. And the whole story feels sad and controlled and very dangerous. In the bottom middle there, we have a still from Schindler's List, the horrendous Holocaust story. A brilliantly told story, but much of that was set in the winter. The story covers many years of these people's lives, but it seems like most of the shots we see are when the Jews are in winter. We have very few summery shots. We see most of the time in fall and winter, which truly reinforces the horrible nature of the Holocaust. Because not only were people being rounded up and killed, but there's no way to survive because they were trying to survive on very little food, very little clothing, etc. And so the genre that oftentimes associates most closely with winter is that of satire. So like winter is devoid of feeling and color and hope, satire is usually a very negative genre that is poking fun at things, saying, here's all the things that are wrong in society, and it tries to point those out to the reader. And so again, how do we use this knowledge of the seasons to help us as readers? Pay attention to what season the story is set in. Is this in the spring? It'll probably feel more lighthearted and jovial and happy. Is this set in the winter? It's probably going to be pretty sad. There's probably going to be death in it. Do these seasons reinforce what's going on, or does the change of seasons predict what's going to happen? If you notice that most of the book is set in winter, but you sense and get narration that shows that spring is around the corner, this book is probably going to end a little bit happier, because spring is a happier season, and that's reinforced through the narration. And as always, how does this change affect the story? Either reflect that or predict that. So in summary, couple things to think about. Look at the weather and the seasons in our narration. What season is this story set in, and do the seasons change? Does that reflect or predict how the feeling or the tone or the thematic feeling of this text is going to progress? But then also look at more specifically at the day-to-day weather that characters are in. Is it something stable, like a warm air mass in the summer? Or is the situation more prone to change, like the violent changes of weather in the spring or the fall? If characters are in those, perhaps it is reflecting their emotions, their scenario, their situation. It could also be predictive in nature. If we see the change in weather, that could be letting us know that something bad or a change for the good is coming. So I think that's about it for now. As always, if you have any questions, please go ahead and bring those into class and we'll get you squared away. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you soon.